This episode, again, I hate to keep bashing this point, but this episode is yet another example of why I really wish they hadn't shown us the control, mind control, mental manipulation, whatever the hell's going on with Garibaldi. Because all but one of the things in this episode pretty much lines directly up with this being a natural progression of Garibaldi's character arc. And, in fact, this episode is pretty much Garibaldi the episode, and some brilliant stuff about that. But before I get into that, I want to talk about Ivanova. First of all, I feel very bad for Ivanova. It's nice to see a small problem that's still believable that has to be dealt with. I talked just last episode about technobabble and the problems of technobabble. Here we have an episode about needing more power. That's the problem. They need more juice in order to be able to push the signal far enough, fast enough. Very simple. I just bring that up because for anybody who watches Voyager or early Enterprise on a regular basis, you would look at that and be like, well, we can't send the signal. Why? Well, we need a super mega field in order to depolarize this destegomezeron. Or whatever. I can't do technobabble, if that's not obvious. So I just like seeing something a little more believable and a little more logical. It's also really sad because nobody listens to Zathras. Even Zathras does not listen to Zathras. Can't you tell? It's Zathras. 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 Zothras. I kind of wish they had done that and make it more obvious, the differentiation. Because they've got two A's in there. There's a lot of different ways to pronounce the letter A. But whatever, it's funnier. There's also a great speech he gives. It's comedic, where he says, oh yes, dirt talks with dirt. Dirt gets walked on by everyone, just like Zathras. But what I like about that is the implication of, for lack of a better term, a very Vorlon-esque kind of mentality there. The idea of just kind of embracing one's destiny, one's purpose, one's place in the universe, rather than railing against it or being resigned to it, which are the other two obvious things you can choose to do. Just a nice little touch. So, now I know this is a weird time to talk about this, but then the episode ends with the voice of the Resistance finally going live, which is awesome, but it's also awesome for another reason, because it's the first time, basically this entire time, that they have really fought against President Clark on his battlefield. I know that sounds like a weird statement, so I'm going to try and explain by analogy, because that's how I explain everything. I don't do definitions. I talked about this on a recent Lore Week, which was like 2 months ago now. Anyways, let's imagine that we're at a sports event, and you have to win a football event, a baseball event, and, I don't know, a volleyball event, okay? In order to win the overall thing, win the cup. So you've gone over to the football field, and you've kicked, goal, everything's great. And then you're running around trying to face your enemy, and there's no enemy there. They aren't even facing you on the battlefield because they're kicking your ass over on the volleyball court. Now, I use those two as a parallel specifically because volleyball and football, I'm referring to soccer, are completely different styles of gameplay, completely different styles of sports. And you may be fighting them unopposed, but all you're doing is handing them easier and easier victories in the things where they're fighting you unopposed. So what is happening in this episode is they have finally moved their forces over onto the same battlefield. We're no longer, obviously military action is something that can and will happen. Supplies and economic warfare is something that can and should happen. But you need information warfare as well. This is a very political and very social war that they're fighting. And the sway and opinion of people, as well as government officials, is very important. After all, Sheridan is very lawful good, which is kind of relevant to the overall significance. But I digress. Speaking of Sheridans, there's a really great scene, if short, between Sheridan, G'Kar, and Londo, also known as my favorite frickin' characters. In that scene, first of all, notice G'Kar basically doesn't even want to say anything. He can't even bring himself to speak. He's just... And Sheridan acknowledges how hard it is for G'Kar to be there, which is nice. And then Sheridan pretty much begs him, this is serious, I wouldn't ask you here if I didn't need you. And if not, and I like this because this series has done so much to establish how much G'Kar, A, owes them, B, is loyal to them, and C, has respect for Sheridan personally, so all the three of those things can overcome his immense reluctance to even be in the same room as Londo. Remember how he talked to Londo last time they talked? And Londo himself is like, ugh. Also notice something. I actually kept track 3 separate times during the course of the conversation. Sheridan emphasizes and re-emphasizes civilians. This is about protecting civilians. This is about safeguarding civilian lives, blah, 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 blah. I very much like that. It once again goes back to that idealized militaristic perspective I've talked about before that Sheridan personifies. The idea that a military's purpose, when not in war, is to protect civilians, to make sure that everything's flowing and moving properly, right? And he emphasizes that and emphasizes that and emphasizes that, and I love that. And then it's funny because Sheridan, of course, isn't really thinking this from a political perspective. But G'Kar and Londo, both of whom are career politicians, immediately point out the obvious. This looks like a power grab. Remember I mentioned in just the last episode, there's a lot of different forces who, for their own reasons, are reaching out to do more or accomplish more in the wake of the Shadow War. Well, this looks like another one of those things, from an external perspective. In every way it does, really. And you could say whatever you want about protecting the border or only interfering with military aid and blah, 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 but nobody's going to believe that at first. Not unless something pushes it forward. Now, Sheridan at least acknowledges that truth, and that's why he called in G'Kar and Londo. But the political side of this thing is... let's just say it's more complicated than Sheridan is aware of. And we'll get more to that in the future when it comes in the actual episodes. That's all we've got for now. I do, however, want to point out one other thing. Sheridan flat out says, no, this is not fair, but if we don't do this, their blood will be on our hands for not intervening. Do you want that? Do you want their blood on your hands? And I point that line out because both G'Kar and Londo react perfectly. No dialogue. No dialogue. Just look at their faces. Especially Londo's. You can tell he doesn't want any more blood on his hands, and neither does G'Kar. He also says something else I find interesting because it's so true, and it's not talked on in fiction all that often. It is relatively easier to unite against a common enemy. The enemy mine scenario is a very common scenario in fiction, and for good reason. I hate you, but common enemy, let's go! That doesn't always work that way, of course. It's not always sunshine and roses. Sometimes it's the Horde and the Alliance who can't stop killing each other while they're being invaded by an extra-dimensional force. Sometimes it just doesn't work out. But it is a very common trope, and with good reason. Even in real life, it is relatively easy to understand the concept of putting aside grudges, at least right now, to deal with the bigger threat. To be blunt, it's just plain logical. However, what I like about this is that now we have to come together for something much more difficult. And it can't even be described within a single sentence. A common enemy. You could just say that. A common enemy. 3 words, bam. Everyone knows what that means. How do you describe a more functional, unified, civilian-based government with economic and social freedom that allows for prosperity for everyone involved in blah, 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 blah. I could keep going. You get the idea. How do you describe that? It's so much harder to unite for such a more nebulous goal, even if that goal is something that is generally more desired than beating a big enemy. It's more difficult. It's the harder choice to do. And that is what is now facing our army of light. They bonded together to fight the big bad. Now they've got to try to bond together to make a better future. And by the way, that is my answer to my own question. That's how you summarize that. Which is funny, because someone else says that in this episode, which brings us over to Garibaldi. Like I said, this is very much a Garibaldi episode. First of all, great scene at the beginning. First of all, the woman mentioning that she has lung damage, so she, they don't say it, but the extra has no lines. She just has a few facial expressions, and she gives a couple of hugs. There's some SAG rules about that, and that's why that is that way. You notice a lot of extras in this episode, and in every episode of Everything Ever, don't say a lot of lines, and that's why. I mention this because it's a nice way to explain in character why it is she's not saying anything, because lung damage, right? And of course, the guy who does say lines can say enough for most of them. It's kind of a camp performance, but what I really like is Garibaldi's reaction to the whole thing. He very much has the Morden perspective here. Not Mr. Morden from Babylon 5, Morden from Mass Effect 2, a.k.a. it's difficult to look at a massive... He even says it, you look at a big galactic map, and it's like, aha! Yes! It's easier, it's different, it's more personal to save a person whose face you can see, whose reaction you can see, than it is to save a culture or an empire or whatever, right? Now, there's a nice bit where Zach comes to get his stuff back. Now, I say that's nice for 3 reasons. The first reason it's nice is because it sets up some of the dilemmas he's going to be dealing with through the rest of the episode. That's nice. Again, absence of technobabble. They pretty much slide in there early on the problems he's going to be facing because he's not going to have the access he's used to having. Okay. Second reason it's nice, and I brought up notes over here to remember the exact name of the episode. In the shadow of Zahadum, Garibaldi resigned, briefly. First thing he did was he turned in his gun, his station ID, and his link. It's the first thing he did, because that's the regs, which Garibaldi knows. He may not agree with them, I'll get to that point next, but he knows the regs and he knows how it works. He did it instantly. Why didn't he do it this time, when he resigned several episodes ago? I only point that out because all of the possible explanations fall short that I've been able to come up with. And again, it goes back to that Garibaldi is just not acting like Garibaldi problem I've mentioned before. Even Zach points that out in this episode. Oh, which reminds me of the third point. Garibaldi is not lawful good. He does not obey the regs. He does not think of things like Sheridan does. He is the chaotic good guy, and I've pointed that out before. And it is very Garibaldi to be the guy who is totally fine with going against the regs if he feels like it's going to be beneficial for some reason or another. Except, in this case, he pretty much only does that because he wants to make sure that... You see, it's not quite in line with his character. It's one step out of line for his character. So it's something you could excuse. Because, again, he already resigned before. We know what he does when he resigns before. But this time, he insists on keeping everything until he's called to it. Why? It's a convoluted situation, and we'll see it continue to grow as we go forward. The next thing I want to point out is, of course, Lease shows up. And this is when I start to wonder how much of this has been orchestrated. This is so Tetris that it makes me wonder if this is just a series of coincidences, or if everything lined up perfectly. Because he happens to have he happens to be betrayed by Zach, someone he trusts and cares about. And then on the very same day, he is asked to betray that trust in return, so he says, yes, now I can do that. And then he has to take care of Lease, and then that leads him to the situation where he's actually protecting her, and just blah, 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 blah. This really much pushes him in a certain direction, and it makes me wonder how much of that is deliberate and intentional. But I also have to get real quick. I also have to say that the flashbacks, once again, just kind of make me go, I've already talked about it, I get it. Storytelling tool. You don't want to rely on your audience remembering everything perfectly, or rely on them watching it a second time. Still have the same opinion on it, though, that I did in the previous instances. This is also the first episode where we see Zach starts to really start moving against Garibaldi. Starts to actively, flat out say, no, something's up here. And does something about it. I make that point because Zach has pointed out before that there's something up with Garibaldi. He knows Garibaldi quite well, after all. But he's never actually been willing to do anything other than just kind of shrug and assume things are going to work themselves out. What's funny is this episode is actually very much about standing up, taking the punch on the face, and actually doing something about it. The voices of the resistance, we're finally going to be pushing it back against Clark. Getting Jakar and Londo together, no longer leaving that aside, but actually trying to deal with the situation. Garibaldi actually deals with Lease. He even deletes her message later. And of course, Zach is now willing to do something against Garibaldi. In this case, it's taking his stuff back. I point that out because I firmly believe that a few episodes ago, before he'd been willing to man up in this manner, he wouldn't. He would make excuses or be like, maybe, come on, Chief, let's just do this. But in this case, he's willing to actually effectively take action against Garibaldi because he thinks something's up, and he's willing to finally do something about it. I also really love this great line. I don't need a drink to do that. He says, I'm gonna send you home, and I'm going to forget this ever happened, and I don't need a drink to do that. That is a very powerful line. It has tremendous impact, especially given what we know about Garibaldi, and the actress playing Lise perfectly nails the fact that she also recognizes how big of a deal that is, that he has sufficiently moved past that point, that when he is in this horrible situation and his heart's been broken again, and he's screwed over by everything, that he doesn't need a drink. It's good stuff, and I love it. Real quick, this is just a small little thing. The racial bias between Earth and Mars has been something that's been an undercurrent since Season 1. I like the small little perspective on it here. One of those little things. Usually when you think of oppressive regimes or cultural bias or racial prejudice, you think of things like riots and violence in the streets and, in unlawful imprisonments and seizures and all those horrible stuff, right? High-tier stuff, in other words. Big things. A lot of people tend to forget how small, simple things can ruin lives, hurt people in ways that aren't physical or obvious, and are nevertheless very deep, vicious cuts. In this case, she doesn't get to see her daughter. What in the world? She doesn't get to see her daughter. She has lost her child, and basically lost everything else from the sound of it, because she's Mars-born. And he was Earth-born. And so the Earth judge weighed in favor of the Earth-born. So, yeah, that's one life basically completely ruined. Now you might argue, well, she got it better as a result of that. That's not really excusing the action of the judge, now is it? He didn't sit down and think, I will rule this way so that you can get with someone even more wealthier. No, that's not how that works. So here's a question about the telepathic virus. No spoilers, by the way. Do you think they're telling the truth in this episode? They kind of lay it all out. This is a virus that spreads through telepaths that only really affects other telepaths and only affects a few, but it is a horrible mutation and blah, blah, blah. First question, do you think they were telling the truth? Again, no spoilers. Second question, and I find this one far more fascinating. We know the Vorlons built telepathy into humans. We know that now. That was back in Zahadum, where they mentioned that, and that's been hinted at before, especially what they did with Lita. So, do you think this is a deliberate thing, a Ketracel White situation on behalf of the Vorlons, deliberately building into their telepaths a certain dependency or a certain biological ticking clock, if you will, that ensures that if the Vorlons aren't there to manage it, or if they go against the Vorlons, they have some weapon against them. Food for thought. So then they have the action sequence. Very smart stuff. Probably my favorite sequence is when the guy peeks his head out, points the gun at him, pulls the gun away, and leaves. I love that because Garibaldi figures it out just like that. Instantly. Very, very Garibaldi. I've said it before. He's the detective. He can put two and two together and understand complex facts very smoothly. He doesn't shoot. The other guy doesn't shoot. Okay, run. We need to go. And I love this part. Just think, Bay 3, Bay 3, Bay 3, Bay 3. I want you blasting that over and over. Okay. And she doesn't understand. Nobody understands. It's just, come on, let's go, let's go. Because they're telepaths. And he put that together very quickly. Awesome. I love that. He basically white noises the situation. And then, of course, they go to the bay and they fight them, and we are, for the future! I'm not going to comment on that line just yet. But I think it will be relevant in the future, ironically enough. One quick question. I mean, he then deletes the message. I already mentioned that, standing up, taking it on the face. There's actually a better term for that, and I don't know what it is. It's the idea that rather than trying to avoid a problem, or ignore a problem, or be afraid of a problem. Say, I can't deal with this, or I don't want to deal with this. Standing up, manning up, womaning up, whatever, and taking it on the chin and just dealing with the problem, even though it hurts, even though you don't want to think about it, even though you don't want to deal with it, you take care of the problem like a responsible individual should. And I say that, it sounds easy, trust me, from personal experience. It's very, very difficult to do that, I know. I still struggle with that to this day. I'm sure we all do. But the idea being, he has managed to conquer alcohol, and then she leaves a message, and he decides, no. Cuts it off. Here's a question for you, though. Mr. Edgars contacts him. Just a voice. Don't worry, we'll see him in the future. And talks about the whole situation. I want you to sit back for a moment and put the pieces together. William Edgars decided not to go himself, so he had to send a representative. Now, the gentleman who was who was transiting the product basically says, I am only going to give this to William Edgars or his representative, not his wife. Just his representative. Anybody could have been that representative. Hell, it could have been Wade for all purposes. So why send her? I bring this up as well because earlier Wade flat out mentions to one of his associates regarding Mr. Garibaldi in the beginning, let's go ahead and bring him. We'll put him into a crunch situation. And if he does well, great. And if he dies, oh well. He is expendable. That would also make Lease expendable. And so, even though we're probably already negatively biased towards Mr. Edgars, because, I don't know about you guys, but here in the United States, we tend to automatically presume that rich people are the bad guys. And let's be honest, there's a lot of history of why we think that way. We now have pretty conclusive, complex evidence that we can detect of ourselves through the episode in a Garibaldi style to prove that William Edgars has basically deliberately put his wife in harm's way, and probably did it on purpose to try and get in better with Mr. Garibaldi. So, that's nice. I can't wait to meet him in the future and then punch him in the face! Pah! I don't actually have anything else to say. I have a quick coda, though, if you'll forgive me. If you don't care, this isn't about the episode, you can just chop this off. I've noticed that my ruminations on Babylon 5 are actually getting shorter. I want some feedback on that, because from my perspective, they're getting better. Like, each episode, I feel more confident in these ruminations that I've been doing over the last few weeks. I feel like I'm really nailing the points and really ripping some of the essence out of the episodes. Lord knows some of the episodes tend to be longer because I have more to talk about. But I don't feel like I'm missing anything. I don't feel like I'm shortchanging these. And I would like to know your guys' feelings, because, of course, you're the ones listening to this. So, regardless of that, I hope to see you guys next time.